The Apostle Peter tells us in his second epistle, towards the end of the first chapter, that they were witnesses. He says, "But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him by the majestic glory, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased,' we heard this voice borne from heaven, for we were with him on the holy mountain." Can we claim that? Should it not be the case that in some measure, when we come down from the altar of encounter, we too have been with him on the holy mount and have been rubbing the fringe of majesty? Have we been listening to the voice of the beloved? Or do we come down and clap a man? Have we listened to the Spirit or to noise? Have we encountered Jesus or been occupied with creating falsely an atmosphere and missing the point? Now, it's kind of important because our liturgy in many areas is at risk of being contaminated, and we ourselves are at risk of deflecting the graces that God has prepared for us in those encounters. The Holy Mount is indeed there, wherever the Blessed Sacrament is, and so to change mode completely from the vertical to the horizontal, not only within the celebration itself, but immediately after, especially by talking and not making thanksgiving, is to deflect grace. Jesus is saddened, and so are his angels. As I mentioned last time, there are areas which are favoured by the orientation of things. The gaze carries the weight of the soul. We concentrate on what we watch. So if we gaze at the crucifix, there our thought rests. If we gaze at men, there our thought rests. If the whole people of God looks at Jesus without the distraction of a man, there their thought rests. If they all wait for something interesting to happen, as it might be the case in someone who is performing well at a table, then that is the level of thought. We're not angels. It matters what we see. One of the writers in the later period of the liturgical movement was Gerard Ellard, a Jesuit. In 1948, he had this popular American work published, and it contained quite a few insights. The title being "The Mass of the Future." It attempts a full-length account of the aims and objectives of the liturgical movement. Assuming developments in the Mass rite are going to occur, Ellard enunciates the following principles. In the Catholic Church, nothing can be said to have a future, save insofar as it has a past. and is deeply rooted in tradition. On those marginal areas where the Mass is reckoned as our joint worship, Christ's and ours, its offering, it is clear, is capable of a good and a better, of stagnation or of growth, of loss or of gain. Every single period in the Church's history has contributed to enrich these rites, and the 20th century will want to go on making its contribution too, all in orderly and proper fashion. Sentire cum ecclesia, agere cum ecclesia. So he's very much in line, not standing alone. Sentire cum ecclesia, feel with the Church, and agere cum ecclesia, act with the Church. In putting its hand to the task, the 20th century will be guided by that cognate law, traced by the great Cardinal Newman for appraising dogmatic growth. So a cognate law will be a law of cognition. There is, according to Newman, no violent break with the past. Development must be true to and consonant with its own immediate background. That's the line of thought that we have in the whole of his essay on the development of Christian doctrine, which he wrote as an Anglican, but when he got to the end he saw where his thought was going and he couldn't escape the consequences. So, whatever study and prudent zeal may prompt 20th century Catholics to contribute to the Eucharistic heritage of the ages, they will certainly avoid casting overboard any value a previous age brought with it. There's an echo of that feeling and thought in what Pope Benedict had to say and circulated throughout the Universal Church when inviting the whole Church to be open once more to the older form of the Mass. He puts it thus in Summorum Pontificum. What millennia of Christians have regarded as the most sacred part of its life cannot be regarded as unsacred by those who follow them. And so it is the life of the Church, and the Church is always itself. It cannot deny itself. And the presumption and pride involved in the attitude of a soul that thinks it knows better than 2 millennia of history and the saints that formed themselves in there will have another thing coming. Ellard's principles are in harmony with liturgical tradition and provide another example of the liturgical movement's concern that liturgical development be organic. His use of Newman in this respect is particularly illustrative. He also manifests the increasing importance of study on the question of liturgical reform. while scholarship served the reform of St. Pius V to establish the authentically developed objective liturgical tradition, the antiquarian position of scholar reformers has been consistently rejected. That position presumes that the purity is as early on as possible, and that one needs therefore to find the simplicity of the origin and artificially go back to it, making abstraction of natural growth in between. Thus, in practice, creating a newfangled, imagined version of antiquity and missing the growth guided by the Spirit. Ellard identifies himself with the rejection of the latter by Pius XII. Pius XII was a brilliant man. Mystici Corporis is a brilliant document. He knew exactly what he was saying and wanting. The person of culture knows all the elements. There's a lot of truth in the old saying, a little learning is a very dangerous thing. And unfortunately, it is often people with a loud voice and relatively little learning who rule the roost. Ellard's principles are applied in the third section of his volume. He argues that the Mass could be renamed the Eucharistic Sacrifice. Now he has a reason for that, because the actual expression missa is puzzling in its origin. It means in itself dismissal, and it could be originally linked with the fact that these words would have been heard at the end of the Mass of the Catechumens. Missa est. It is the dismissal. And the dismissal of the catechumens, the missa of the catechumens, then was linked with what was to follow that magic word, because they were not invited to be participants in what they could not yet receive. But the word stuck, so it's incomplete if one wants to express the whole significance of the Eucharistic sacrifice. And so there was a feeling in the air also amongst workers in the liturgical movement that the word itself was questioned as regards the best possible expression of the fullness of mystery being celebrated. I noticed in Romania, when celebrating, of course, in the Western Rite there, that they talked in Romanian, even in our context, of the Divina Liturgia. There was still that link between the East so strongly in that bridge country that it had permeated even certain elements of the West, and the liturgy was called by that name, the Divine Liturgy or the Holy Liturgy, in even Catholic worship in Romania. And there was also a certain cross-fertilization with regard to respect and reverence, which wasn't a bad thing. He argues that the Mass could be renamed the Eucharistic sacrifice, and calls for increased permissions for the vernacular. Calendar revision, a codification of the rubrics of the Missal to include authoritative clarifications and directives, and the inclusion of some new biblical pericope, that's passages, groups of verses, are suggested, as are some minor ceremonial improvements based on precedents already in the Roman Rite. A reordering of churches is envisaged that tends to favour, but does not insist upon, the facing of the people, that is, missa versus populum. Communal singing in the vernacular as well as in Latin is hoped for. Meaningful offertory processions are seen as integral, as is more frequent sacramental communion. There is a healthy hankering after practices of the early church. There had been the custom not to receive very much Holy Communion at the High Mass at 11 o'clock. In some areas, people might actually receive Holy Communion extra missam at 8 o'clock in the morning at a Holy Communion service with only Holy Communion given, but come back then for the full celebration later on, at which only the priest might receive. All that was bit by bit adjusted. The offertory procession, too, is early, and we are given descriptions of that in Justin Martyr. Mass propers for different categories of lay people, festivals and occasions are hoped for. Now, many of these intuitions did get through, and we have far more variation now in the prefaces and in the richness of various formulae in general. The rationing of votive requiem masses is called for to allow the faithful access to the weekday liturgical texts. The requiem had a fairly simple structure compared with the other ones used on weekdays. For instance, the psalm would not be there at the foot of the altar, and it was fallen back on quite often as the one to be celebrated on a weekday. Otherwise, they had a choice between retaking the Sunday one or taking a votive one, or one of maybe the saint of the day. The problem was that there was therefore a very large redoubling of texts. One was hearing a lot the same readings, because remember now, everything was in one volume, and each category of saint had the same reading. So you had often a fairly short fare with regard to the variation, and this was one of the intuitions of the liturgical movement, that the people of God need to have a more broad and nourishing fare, and also to listen and understand, because what they were doing in practice was they were praying maybe the rosary and not actually engaging with the liturgical words themselves, either the prayers or the readings. These were all intuitions which did pass into Sacrosanctum Concilium bit by bit. And the whole question of the lectionary being broadened to include a cycle for the weekdays as well was quite a revolution. Add to that the desire to have also not the same readings for each of the 52 Sundays of the year, but to have a 3-year cycle, then we see how there was a real revolution taking place when it came to opening the Word of God and also in the vernacular. Now these are positive elements of renewal, but it took a long time to get through. The celebration of Mass at more convenient times, including the evenings, is wanted. Now, we must remember also that there wasn't much time to develop the liturgy, because with the large number of priests, quite often a priest was obliged to celebrate within half an hour, and there might be another celebration following immediately afterwards. Also, celebrations would go on simultaneously in the same church. So there was no way that the liturgy of the Word was going to be developed. There was a lot of mumbling going on. However, it was a holy mumbling, and I was very moved when, at 17, for the first time I was exposed to the power of Ampleforth. There, about 120 monks belonging to Ampleforth, they were very much into prayer, and I remember how, between Matins and Lauds, I would go down to the crypt, and wow, what is all happening down there? There were altars everywhere, altars everywhere, priests all over the place, and mumbling. Wow, was that some mumble? In their application, Ellard's proposals are consonant with his principles. He gives weight to the needs of modern man and to desirable revivals that do no radical violence to objective liturgical tradition. He does, though, fall for the facing the people fad. Yet the Ordo Missae is respected intact. It is rather primarily people's attitudes and practices that Ellard seeks to reform. Again, we see the movement's sense of tradition and its prudent desire for organic development. However, being formed in a French-speaking community and with our roots deeply in France, I was aware that even before the Council, there had been a movement towards certain things. And because of the power of the Scout movement, even before the Second Vatican Council, apparently there were chaplains who would face the Scout group, even in the Tridentine Rite, in Scout camps. There was nothing hugely naughty felt to be about that, because the Tridentine Rite does allow for that, although in fact it was not the case. I mean, theoretically it could happen, because precisely it would happen in Rome, in the major basilicas. But in practice it was not happening, because the church was all constructed the other way. But the point is that this question of identifying certain things with certain things is not sufficient. Also, the use of the vernacular only for the readings was there in place for a good while, and that was just taken on spontaneously. I noticed how, in our case, in the monastery, if the prior was celebrating the Old Rite with a group who was specifically of the exclusive Old Rite, that he would automatically take the readings in French only. So this was the calm way in which in France things were happening already. And remember, France and Germany, these countries were key countries in renewal. And there was a quiet way there. It wasn't felt to be a discontinuity. I would like to conclude with one thing. It's this. In the period during the Council, immediately after the Council, and immediately after the publication of the Missal of Paul VI, which came into use around about the first Sunday of Advent, 1969, before the end of that year, the beginning of 1970 essentially, although there was an exaggeration in some areas and in some corners of the universe with regard to an overreaction which, as it were, refused the past and exploded things, in the initial stages there was enough instinct and continuity to protect. Because all those involved, as priests, as celebrants, as ministers, as anything at all, were educated to the sacred. It was felt, and the Spirit was able to teach the soul and give them the sensus fidelium. Our situation is radically, radically different. Moreover, there is a problem. Those were going to be the ones who eventually would have authority, and they themselves, unfortunately, got into a certain mode which bit by bit chipped away at the sacred, and they got contaminated quite quickly by a very different mode. And some of them went quite far in that direction, and insofar as they were of human value, they were able to invent many things and be quite spectacular. But there was that feeling coming in amongst influential ones that the past was to be feared and rejected, and that what we had was the correct version. It was almost an either-or mentality. And then anything which, from, for instance, younger clergy or people of other instincts, was felt to be a desire for what they had successfully corrected, in other words, the past, was felt to be a threat. And then we had this element of a camp against a camp coming in. That was a tragedy and very human. The Holy Spirit is as wide as the ages and as knowing as all the knowledge of the world. It's ourselves who are limited and blinkered and feel the need for a comfort zone and easily get into either or. In Latin, that is out, out. And the alternative is et, et. We need to be people of both and. Hagios, Hagios, Hagios. Sanctus, 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 Dominus Deus Sabaoth. O light, I see thee not, but feel thy face. There is a presence here. There is, my Lord, not matter in this little space made of the ground of being, but of word that bid all being be. I see enough, my hidden love, to love thee well. I understand that standing here will be the last command of heaven and of hell. My Lord, I shall not go again afar. I shall not gaze into another eye. The better part is here. For where we are, there is a music twixt the earth and sky, and will can meet in but a look of gazing Godhead, that a sharp aim took. Agios oteos, agios ischiros, agios athanatos, eleison imma.